Good day. Today we discuss one of the philosophies of ethics of contemporary philosophy. We focus on William David Ross' prima facie duties. David Ross' prima facie duties could be understood or better situated within the realm of uh, duty ethics, and we can connect or relate his prima facie duties to the concept of duty of Immanuel Kant. Because while Immanuel Kant discussed about the categorical imperative, duty, and he discussed the different articulations of the categorical imperatives, when it comes to duty, he did not specify what are these duties, no? What are the specific duties. David Ross specifies what are the prima facie duties or the self-evident duties. Okay? So, just a very brief introduction about David Ross. He's a philosopher that is not, compared to the other major philosophers, not very popular, but he has published works on ethics and translated the works of Aristotle. So he was a Scottish philosopher known for his works on ethics and for his translations of the works of Aristotle. He was born on April 15, 1877 in Thurso, Scotland, and he spent the bulk of his first 6 years of his life in Travancore, India, where his father, John Ross, was the principal of the Maharaja's College. He then returned to Scotland for his formal education and studied at the Balliol College in Oxford. After graduation in 1900, he was appointed as lecturer at Oriel College, Oxford, and at the same time, he was elected to a fellowship by examination at Merton College. In 1902, he was elected tutor in philosophy and fellow at Oriel College, a position which he held until 1929. He joined the army in 1915, and then in 1927, he was elected fellow of the British Academy, and he served as its president from 1936 to 1940. He served as Vice Chancellor of Oxford from 1941 to 1944. And then, following the war in 1947, he became president of the Union Académique Internationale and until 1949, the chairman of the Royal Commission on the Press. In his retirement, Ross continued to work in philosophy, and he died in Oxford on May 25, 1971. Ross made numerous contributions to the translations and interpretations of Aristotle and moral philosophy. In his lifetime, Ross was considered a major figure in the study of Aristotle. His best known work is The Right and the Good, published in 1930, which is a treatise on ethics. Ross ethics is a form of intuitionist ethics, combining some aspects of consequentialism with some aspects of the ontological ethics. In the book that we mentioned, he presented an ethical theory that can be viewed as an attempt to join aspects of utilitarianism with those of Kantianism. Ross begins his attempt to provide methodology for resolving conflicts of duties by dismissing the consequentialist belief that what makes an act right is solely whether it produces the most good. Because we know that from a consequentialist perspective, especially from a utilitarian perspective, the basis for the morality or the ethicality of an act is its consequences, especially when we talk about utilitarianism, whether that promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Uh, so Ross notes consequences of conflicting behaviors counterbalance each other. Therefore, you cannot really base the ethicality or morality of an act based on consequences because sometimes there are conflicting consequences that could oppose or counterbalance each other. Ross um, argues that when deciding among ethical alternatives, instead of thinking about consequences, we must weigh the options to determine what duties we fulfill in performing or in refraining from performing its option. Then, then we decide which duty among the alternatives is the most obligatory. So if there is a conflict between two consequences or conflicts between two possible consequences, you think of what are the duties involved and which consequence will either affect or promote our basic duties. So the consequence that will promote the or will be aligned more to the duty, then that should be the duty that is the better alternative. Hence he stands on the following basic positions. First, judgments of an action's morality is not solely dependent on its consequences. And second, there are duties or obligations that bind us morally. And these duties, presumably, can be stated in rules. That's why he came up with the prima facie duties, because these are uh, duties or obligations that bind us morally. Now, let's go to the first point here. So that's just a very general introduction about his ethics or ethical theory, the intuition of moral rules, because he stated that duties can be stated in rules. So, what are these moral rules? How do we intuit them? Ross claims that we come to know these moral rules or principles by intuition, meaning they're sort of self-evident. When they come as self-evident, they impose their their obligatory nature on us. So he holds that the most fundamental part of our moral knowledge is the intuition of certain moral principles. The intuition of certain moral principles. So if we reflect on these moral principles, then we stand a better chance of doing what is right than if we do not reflect on them. So it's important that we better understand, we reflect on these moral principles so that we can fully understand them. The form of the intuited moral principle is that either all acts of a certain kind are right or all acts of a certain kind are wrong. Take, for example, all acts of promise keeping are right. All acts of promise keeping are right. So when you promise, then you have to uh, keep that promise. Now, according to Ross, that principle, that moral principle, could either be right or wrong. Right. Now, take the example: all acts of injury are wrong. So they are either right. All acts of telling or keeping promise are right, or all acts of injury are wrong. So, and then all acts of telling the truth is right. So these are moral principles. Now, such principles, according to Ross, are known intuitively. In other words, we directly understand that to cause injury is wrong and to tell the truth is wrong. It seems to be in our moral fabric to understand that, right? So they are known intuitively. If we understand that what the principles mean, then we recognize the truth and we do not uh, it does not take any additional evidence to know that these principles are true. So we don't really prove that the principle of telling truth is right because we just know it. Okay, there's no need to present proof or to argue that telling the truth is right because it is indeed right. Okay, or doing something bad or injuring people, okay, causing harm on other people is wrong. We don't need to argue, we don't need to present proof as to the truthfulness of that moral principle. So, having recognized the truth of a moral principle, we can now reflect on it to determine what we ought to do in a particular situation. So, if you find yourself in a particular situation where you have to tell or to be honest or to tell the truth, then you will know what to do in that particular situation, having understood the moral principle. So, an act may fall under a number of rules at once. So, for example, the rule of keeping a promise may, in a given circumstance, conflict with the rule not to do any harm. Right? If you promise somebody that you're going to, say, send him to school, or you promise somebody that um, you're going to give him something. But at that point, when the time comes that when you have to give him what you have promised, there are circumstances that would prevent you from fulfilling that promise. Like, for example, uh, you can miss your class, for example, or you can miss something and so on. So there could be some conflicts between one particular rule and another rule. Okay, so conflict between keeping promise and doing harm. Um, Take, for example, um, a political candidate who promises a wealthy builder that if the builder fund the, the, the contractor, for example, funds his campaign, if and he gets elected, he will deliver an attractive government contract to the contractor or to the builder. The politician is subsequently elected, and then he makes good his promise because, well, he has the obligation to keep his promise. The fact is that the contractor does good work and his prices are competitive. But the politician has violated his duty to society, which trusts that he will not collude or he will not have under the table settlement or agreement with private contractors that concerns to advance his own or their own interest, but will always act strictly in the interest of the public good. So now we have a conflict between the duty of the politician to keep his promise to the contractor or to the builder and his obligation to to protect the trust in the interest of the public. Okay? So here, the contractor did not, or the politicians did not even consider any other bids, which is certainly improper. But he has certainly fulfilled his promise, which he may have viewed as binding. So now you have the conflict between keeping one's promise and not doing any harm. So here we would assume that the politician has acted immorally, but not because the consequences of his action were wrong. He acted immorally because we would consider the reason against what he did to count more than the reasons for what he did. In other words, he would have evaluated the conflicting duties and decided in favor of the one we felt to be more morally compelling. Because in this case, although he has he's promised the contractor that he's going to give him a contract once he gets elected, it's more compelling to do the duty or to perform the obligation to be truthful and to protect the interest of the public. So in such a case, as in most others, each act is accompanied by a number of motivational reasons. Each reason, in turn, appeals to a moral duty to keep a promise, to be faithful to the people who trust us or trust the politician, to be fair, and to be honest. Each of these moral duties provides grounds for doing a particular action, and yet no single one provides sufficient ground. So, in other words, simply because the politician has a duty to keep his promise to the contractor is not grounds enough for delivering the government contract to his to the builder or to the one who supported his campaign. No, because there are more compelling reason that aside no than his reason to fulfill his promise. So other reasons appear that impose other duties. So yes, he has reason to fulfill his promise to the builder or to the contractor, but there are other reasons, okay, to follow the other obligations. And of course, in this case, protecting, being honest, and being fair, and protecting the people, the interests of the public, has greater reason, a heavier reason, a more compelling reason than fulfilling his promise to the contractor. So both moral principles, fulfilling or keeping to his promise and protecting, not doing any harm to the people and protecting their interest, they have compelling reasons. Okay, but one act, one obligation in this situation. So you have to study the situation. In this situation, it has the public interest, not harming, not harming the interest of people, has a more compelling reason. So we don't just base our decision on what could be the consequences of the act. We're talking of two conflicting moral principles, but which of these moral principles or obligation has more compelling reason to be followed? Okay, so when that conflict uh, appears, or when that conflict comes up, then we have to study the situation, reflect on the situation, and do what is the obligation, the alternative, in this case, the two alternative obligations, which has a more compelling reason. So next is the prima facie duty. So what are these duties? What are these duties? Okay, involved. Well, there could be several duties, but he calls this the prima facie duties, and he enumerates a number of them. Okay, so Ross is particularly sensitive to cases that involve conflicts of duties. So here he offers his concept of prima facie duties. So when he says prima facie duties, it refers to the characteristic of an act, no, that an act has because it is a certain kind of act, okay? A certain kind of act, and the characteristic that is it is self-evident in the act. Okay, self-evident in the act. I mentioned one example, truth telling. So truth telling has it's self-evident, meaning we are always told, we learn, we know it intuitively that to tell the truth is the right thing to do. It's like it's it's the default position of our mind. It's the default position of our moral compass. It always points to truth telling. Okay. So it's more natural to tell the truth rather than tell a lie. Right. So Ross admits that the term prima facie, it's a Latin term meaning on first appearance, is unfortunate because it suggests that one is speaking only on based on an appearance, based on on first sight, no, on first sight, the first encounter, the first view, so to speak, which a moral situation presents at first sight, and which may be illusory. But what he means is an objective fact, no, an objective fact involved in the nature of the situation, or more strictly, in an element of its nature. So he insists that there is nothing arbitrary about prima facie duties because we know them directly. We know them by intuition. Okay, we know them by intuition. Um, we can be confident that when we say "do not harm others," it's it's natural. I mean, uh, we know them by intuition. So the two important characteristics to prima facie duties is first, prima facie duties are intuitive. So that's one. We naturally know them or understand them. Second, prima facie duties are conditional. That is, they can be overridden, although they still retain their character as duties. In other words, yes, one duty is intuitive, but it's conditional in the sense that it can conflict with other prima facie duty, like the one that we have cited, your duty to keep your promise and your duty not to harm people, right? So through intuition, one recognizes a prima facie to keep a promise, okay? To keep a promise. But there may be time when one feels justified, even obligated, to break a promise because that may conflict with other duty. So, for example, in order to prevent injury or pain, you promise, for example, to say, so a parent, for example, may promise, a father promise his child to give him gift during graduation or when he if he graduates or when he graduates and graduation comes. So now the child comes for, of course, expecting that uh, his father will fulfill his promise of giving him something for his graduation. But by some for some reason, um, they have to they incur the family incurred a big expense. Okay, so and they have to spend lots of money for something. Okay, say somebody in the family got sick, so they have to, of course, consult a doctor, spend money for the medication. So keeping promise now has to be postponed or withheld because there's a more compelling situation or reason that could justify the suspension, perhaps, or the breaking of that promise. Okay. So, in breaking one's promise under such conditions, he does not for a minute cease to recognize the prima facie duty to keep his promise. Indeed, in a case with only a single prima facie duty, such promise would be obligated to be carried out that duty if there is no conflict with other duty. It so happens that there's another duty, no? There's another duty to be fulfilled that conflicts with the previous duty. Okay? But even if it conflicts with the other duty or there are conflicts with other duties. The first duty does not lose its prima facie character, right? So Ross gives little attention to such cases because they're not problematic. I mean, he does not give so much attention to uh, fulfilling a duty where there's no conflict with other duties because it's not problematic. All right. So if 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 you promise that you have to do this and it does not conflict with any other thing, there's no reason to not to fulfill the promise, then okay, that's fine. That's okay. So no problem there. Okay. So they pose no real concern to persons who recognize intuitively their duty, for example, to keep promise, and realize that their particular case involves without any conflict an instance of promise keeping. So okay, that's good. Okay. So if promise keeping were the only prima facie duty involved in the earlier, for example, in the earlier case of the politician, then the politician ought to honor the promise. But should he actually keep the promise? Not necessarily, because other duties are involved that may conflict to the promise. In fact, you can always think, why keep that, why keep that promise? Why make that promise? So why make or why accept an obligation when you think that it may conflict with other obligation? Okay, because that's what's problematic for Ross when a duty conflicts with other duty. Okay, that's why we need to reflect on these duties. Okay, and how we apply these duties on specific or particular situation. The example of the politician is, in fact, that promise of the politician to the contractor to provide, give him a contract is open to many conflicts. Okay, not just conflict of duties, but also conflicts of interest. Okay, so Ross distinguishes prima facie duties from actual duties. An actual duty means that we actually ought to do what we ought to do in a situation. In a situation, what we ought to do in a situation. If there is only one prima facie duty involved, then that is what we have to do, that we actually ought to do. But if there are conflicting prima facie duties, our actual duty is what we are obligated to do after we have weighed and considered all the prima facie duties involved and all the reasons involved in the duty. So there is a difference between the prima facie duty, you can list all the prima facie duty, and the actual duty. If there is only one prima facie duty involved, then that is our actual duty. But if there are conflicting prima facie duties, we have to weigh, we have to consider all the other prima facie duties and the reasons, no, different factors. And then after considering all this, we will know what should be our actual duty. So in the case of the father who promised his daughter or his child gift for his graduation, if there's no other duty involved in the family, then that would be his actual duty. But if there are other duties involved, like, taking care of the health of a family member and so on, then he has to weigh everything. And the actual duty would be what could be the more compelling reason. Of course, it depends on the situation. So you have to study, you have to evaluate, assess the situation, and the situation will tell us what would be our actual duty. Okay. So, unlike prima facie duties, actual duties are not intuited. They're not intuited. We don't know what would be our actual duty until we study, we analyze, we consider all the other prima facie duties involved and all the reasons, the factors involved in that situation. So actual duties are not knowledge at all in Ross' view. They are more like favorably educated guesses or lucky accidents. But of course, if we study them, then we can be educated, we can be more informed about what would be our actual duty. Right? So that's how Ross settles the conflicts between uh, duties, conflicting duties, and that's how he distinguished between prima facie duties and our actual duties. Now, again, in our actual duty, when we drop, for example, one alternative duty, it does not lose its prima facie character or status. So promise keeping does not lose its prima facie character, even if we opted for the other duty rather than um, promise keeping. Okay, so that's how for Euros, that's how we settle the first we distinguish between prima facie duty and actual duty, and how we settle conflicts between or among prima facie duties. Now, let's go now to the 6 categories of prima facie duties. Uh, Ross listed 6, but perhaps this is what he enumerated, but perhaps uh, it's perhaps possible to come up with more than 6 prima facie duties, depending, of course, whether we consider that duty to be intuitive also. Okay. So first, the duty of fidelity. The duty of fidelity. There are those that rest on our own prior acts. Okay. So this includes under duties of fidelity would be the duty not to lie in the act of conversation. So the duty to remain faithful to contracts, the duty to keep promises, the duty to repair wrongful acts, duties of fidelity, being faithful, being honest, being true to one's words, being true to one's promise, uh, and so on. Okay, so that's the first duties of fidelity. The second is the duties of gratitude. Those that rest on acts of other people towards us. Okay? It rests on acts of other people towards us, what other people did to us. Okay? So, we are bound by obligation arising from relationships that exist between persons, such as those between friends or between relatives or even, and especially in the family. Right? So, for example, suppose that you annually contribute 100 pesos to your, say, favorite project or charity. And the week before, you are about to make your yearly contribution. But a good friend whom you have not seen in years calls you up. You are delighted to hear your friend's voice and fondly recall the many times the person stood by you in times of crisis. Now, your friend is in need of 1,000 pesos or an amount. In this case, the duty of gratitude will probably oblige you to give the money to your friend rather than to the project or charity. So, duties of gratitude is rest on what other people did to you. Okay, classic example, the duty of gratitude to one's parents. So, our parents, they take care of us when they take care of us from our uh, first years of life until we become mature and adults and so on. Now, in their old age, we have the duty of gratitude. to take care of them also because they have taken care of us when we were young, when we were babies, when we were infant. So the duties of gratitude, being thankful, appreciating what other people did to us, and so on and so forth. That's the duty of gratitude. So that's prima facie duty. Nobody will tell us that that's not, you know, that is not learned intuitively. We learn that, we understand that directly. Then duties of justice. These are those that rest on the fact or possibility of a distribution of pleasure or happiness that is not in accordance with the merits of the people concerned. Possibility of pleasure or happiness, it's not in accordance with the merit of the people concerned. In such cases, there is a duty to upset or prevent such a distribution, meaning it may cause unfairness on some people. So imagine the case of putting in prison a man for something that he did not do. Although he is obviously guilty of other crimes for which he has escaped punishment, but it would be unjust to imprison him for a crime he did not commit. Okay? So while removing the man from society would appear to be in one's best interest, except his own perhaps, a duty of justice obliges us not to imprison him because he does not deserve to be imprisoned for something that he did not do, no matter how beneficial the consequences of imprisonment to other people that he offended because of another crime. That would be unjust. So we have the duty to be just and to be fair, okay, to give what is due to others. Okay. Next is duties of beneficence. There are those that rely on the fact that there are other people in the world whose virtue, intelligence, or happiness can be improved. Okay? It means we have the duty to do good on other people so that their happiness, their condition can be improved. Doing good for others. For example, board members of a firm can improve the happiness of a firm's retirees by voting a cost of living increase in retirement funds, in compensation for deferred illnesses directly related to their employment. Or perhaps we can make donation to, say, a charity institution that would benefit the beneficiaries of that institution. So doing good for others is a prima facie duty. So the duties of beneficence means um, doing something good to other people to help improve their condition, improve their life, to improve uh, their happiness, and so on. So that's beneficence, the duty of doing good for others to improve their lives, to improve their condition. Next is duty of self-improvement. These are duties that rest on the fact that, of course, we can improve our own condition, our own intelligence, our own happiness. So if there is the duty to others, which we can also consider a duty of altruism, then there is also a duty to the self. We can call it egoist duty for whatever, but we always have the duty to improve ourselves. Okay? Suppose, for example, that a young woman is exceptionally talented. She plays many musical instruments, paints very well, seems to have a natural language learn ability, and exhibits high scientific acumen. And while the young woman is in the midst of determining his life goals, a rich relative dies leaving her so much money that she need not work any other day in her life. Now, if she decides to use this inheritance for long-term indulgence, making no attempt to cultivate her talents, then the woman would be violating a duty to improve himself. He has a duty to improve himself, even if he or she receive lots of money. Okay, so even if you win in the lotto, for example, and you have so much, you still have to improve, keep improving it because it's a duty to oneself. Okay, to improve oneself. Then duties of non-maleficence. The duty not to harm others, not to injure others. Okay, so this obligation is contrasted to the duties of beneficence because we have a duty to do good to others, and we also have a duty not to harm others. So that reminds us of uh, the golden rule, no, of Confucius: do unto others what what you think. Do good to others and do not do harm to others. Do unto others what you think is good for you, and do not do to others what you think would be bad for you. Okay, so the duty of beneficence and the duty of non-maleficence. Now, so those are the six prima facie duties that Ross enumerated. But Ross does not claim that these six prima facie duties represent a complete list of recognizable duties. But he does claim that these are duties we acknowledge and willingly accept without argument. Well, we can probably propose to add some more duties, but they may be, some people can argue against them. Okay. So in the case of two conflicting prima facie duties, Ross tells us to fulfill the more obligatory duty, the more compelling duty, after considering all the factors, after weighing the situation and so on. Okay. Where more than two duties are involved, our actual duty should be the one with the greatest amount of prima facie rightness over wrongness. More compelling reasons, meaning more rightness. Okay. More compelling reasons that this is the right thing to do, and that it more compelling reason that the other one has more compelling reason that's going to be wrong. Okay. So this approach to ethics has two main strengths. First, um, the list of duties can play an important role in the moral education of individuals. Okay. So at least we have an initial list of what are these prima facie duties. If nothing else, it provides a useful catalog of duties that one may refer to in particular situation. So at least we have, so it's not just a very general description of what prima facie duties is. It provides us with an initial list of what could be considered prima facie duties. So that could be our initial or starting point in, uh, you know, uh, deciding uh, particular situations, which particular situation carries more obligatory nature. Second, it brings to ethical decisions a utilitarian sensitivity to consequences without ignoring duties of apparently undeniable moral force. Still, we consider the consequences because that's the basis for considering which duty is more obligatory. Okay, that's why I said at the beginning that it tries to combine utilitarianism and or consequentialism and Kantianism. So he combines consequences and duties. Right. So that's about it about Ross prima facie duties. Thank you very much for listening.